The lush, crimson-streaked skies of Las Cullas had always been a source of solace for its inhabitants, a kaleidoscope of soothing hues that painted the horizon in perpetual twilight. But tonight, the sky seemed to tremble with unease, as if it too sensed the unfolding disruption. Badri, a charismatic yet perpetually irked commander of the Las Cullas defense fleet, stood atop the observation platform of the towering Arbiter Spire. The spire loomed over the sprawling city, a gleaming monument of advanced engineering and defiance against a galaxy that often saw them as insignificant. For the Las Calans, the Arbiter Spire was more than a structure, it was their nerve center, their pride, and, on occasion, their last line of defense. "Commander Badri," a voice chimed, breaking his contemplative silence. It belonged to Kala, his sharp-tongued yet unfailingly loyal tactical advisor. "We've intercepted another transmission from the Galactic Council." She handed him a sleek holopad, its screen flickering with the familiar insignia of the Council. The insignia was an amalgamation of stars orbiting a central beacon, meant to symbolize unity but often perceived by outlier systems like Las Cullas as a reminder of imposed subjugation. Badra's lips curled into a smirk as he read the message. "Tribute overdue," he muttered. "Immediate compliance required." "They're really stepping up their rhetoric, aren't they?" His voice dripped with sarcasm, masking the simmering frustration beneath. Kala crossed her arms. "They're not bluffing this time, Badri. Word has it they've sent their envoy, Zeker, to personally enforce the demand. You know what that means." Badri knew all too well. Zeker, a Zythan warrior with a reputation for crushing rebellion with theatrical brutality, was infamous across the galaxy. His arrival was less a negotiation and more a grim reminder of what defiance cost. For Las Cullas, a colony already struggling to maintain its autonomy and resource independence, the demand for tribute was more than extortion, it was existential. "What's the Council's obsession with us anyway?" Badri asked, turning to Kala. "We're not exactly sitting on the galaxy's largest stockpile of tritium crystals or antimatter reserves." Kala arched an eyebrow. "It's not what we have, it's what we represent. A small, defiant colony that refuses to bend the knee. If they let us get away with it, they risk emboldening others." Before Badri could respond, the ground beneath them rumbled faintly. A low hum reverberated through the spire's metallic frame, followed by a distant, thunderous boom. Both Badri and Kala exchanged a glance before sprinting toward the nearest observation console. The city's sprawling vista unfolded before them, a tapestry of bioluminescent streets and towering skyscrapers. But the tranquil scene was now marred by a massive, wedge-shaped starship descending ominously through the crimson clouds. Its sleek, predatory design and shimmering hull marked it unmistakably as a Galactic Council dreadnought. Even from miles away, its presence radiated menace. Badri leaned forward, his jaw tightening. Well, Zeker certainly knows how to make an entrance. The holographic interface before them flickered to life, projecting a towering image of Zeker. The Zythan's reptilian features were accentuated by the intricate, gleaming armor he wore, a blend of ceremonial elegance and deadly efficiency. His piercing, golden eyes scanned the room, landing on Badri. "People of Las Cullas," Zeker's voice boomed, amplified through the spire's comm systems. "You stand at the precipice of obliteration or compliance. The Council's patience has waned, and my presence here should serve as your final warning. Deliver the tribute, or face the consequences." Badri tilted his head, a mischievous grin forming. "And here I thought this was a social call. Zeker, you really know how to ruin a perfectly good evening." Zeker's eyes narrowed. "Your insolence will cost you dearly, Commander." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the room in tense silence. Kala exhaled sharply. "You just had to antagonize him, didn't you?" Badri shrugged. "He already sees us as defiant pests. Might as well lean into the role." As the city's defenses began to mobilize, Badri turned his attention to the group assembled in the Spire's strategy chamber. It was an eclectic mix of scientists, engineers, and resistance fighters, each representing a piece of Las Cullas's patchwork society. Among them was Oren, a brilliant yet perpetually disheveled inventor whose mind seemed to operate on a different frequency. Oren had a habit of interrupting strategy meetings with half-baked ideas, but his inventions had saved the colony more than once. "I've been working on something," Oren announced, holding up a small, spherical device that emitted a faint, oscillating hum. It's not exactly finished, but it might be our ticket out of this mess." Badri arched an eyebrow. "Care to elaborate?" Oren hesitated, glancing around the room. "It's a neural distortion emitter. In theory, it can disrupt the cognitive processes of Zythans, scramble their decision-making, make them second-guess their actions. But it's untested." Kala frowned. "And by untested, you mean it could backfire spectacularly?" Oren nodded sheepishly. "Essentially." Badri leaned back, considering the stakes. The odds were already stacked against them. A half-functional device that could level the playing field, even briefly, was better than nothing. "Do it," he said, his tone resolute. "Get it operational. We don't have time for second-guessing." As Oren scurried away to his workshop, the room buzzed with activity. Maps and holograms displayed the incoming dreadnought's trajectory, and tactical plans were debated and discarded in rapid succession. Badri couldn't shake the feeling that their chances of survival hinged on more than just strategy. It required something unpredictable, something the council couldn't anticipate. Meanwhile, across the city, whispers spread like wildfire. The people of Las Cullas, despite their fear, began to rally. They were a stubborn, resourceful lot, forged in the crucible of adversity. Farmers repurposed equipment into improvised weapons, and mechanics adapted civilian drones into reconnaissance units. Even the artists contributed, creating propaganda murals that depicted a triumphant Las Cullas standing defiantly against the Galactic Council's oppression. As the dreadnought loomed closer, casting an enormous shadow over the city, Badri found himself standing on the spire's balcony, staring into the horizon. The weight of leadership bore heavily on him, but he refused to show it. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was his resolve. Kala joined him, her expression softer than usual. "Do you think we have a chance?" Badri smirked. "A chance? No. A certainty? Also no. But if there's one thing I've learned about this place, it's that we're at our best when the odds are worst." The ground shook again, signaling the dreadnought's landing. Zeker and his contingent of heavily armed enforcers would soon march into the city, expecting capitulation. But what awaited them would be far from compliance. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the crimson clouds, Badri turned to Kala, his eyes alight with determination. "Let's give them a welcome they'll never forget." The streets of Las Cullas were alive with frantic energy as the looming shadow of the Galactic Council's dreadnought darkened the crimson-lit horizon. Makeshift barricades lined the main thoroughfares, cobbled together from anything the resourceful inhabitants could find: scrap metal, old transport hulls, even pieces of dismantled agricultural machinery. Citizens, from seasoned resistance fighters to frightened civilians wielding repurposed tools, stood shoulder to shoulder. Fear was a constant, but defiance burned brighter. Badri paced back and forth in the central command room, his boots clicking against the reinforced steel floor. The holomap projected before him showed the dreadnought's landing site, an ominous pulse marking its position. Surrounding it was a growing cluster of enemy troops, Zeker's elite enforcers, each a walking arsenal of plasma weapons and powered armor. They were fanning out, systematically advancing toward the Arbiter Spire. Kala stood nearby, arms crossed, her sharp gaze fixed on the map. "They're coming in hard and fast. Zeker isn't wasting time." Badri's lips twitched into a wry grin. "Good. That means they're underestimating us." A sudden chime interrupted their conversation. Oren burst into the room, clutching his neural distortion emitter, now mounted on a sleek, wrist-worn device. His hair was a mess, and his lab coat was speckled with soot, but his face radiated triumph. "It's ready," he declared, holding up his arm to show the device. "The neural disruptor Mark I. It's not pretty, but it works." "Probably." Kala raised an eyebrow. "Probably?" Oren shrugged. I tested it on a drone simulator. Fried its circuits in 3 seconds flat. Extrapolating that to Zython brainwaves, it should scramble them. At least long enough for us to get an advantage. Badri clapped Oren on the shoulder. Perfect. We'll take all the probablies we can get. Get that thing set up in the field. As Oren rushed off to deploy his creation, the command room lights flickered, a sign that the enemy had begun to tamper with the city's power grid. Kala sighed. They're cutting off our defenses piece by piece. We need to stall them. Badri nodded, his mind racing. We'll split them up. They've got the firepower, but we know this terrain better than they ever could. He activated his comms, broadcasting to the city's defenders. All right, people, listen up. Zeeker's troops think they're marching into a slaughter. Let's show them they're half right, because it's their own. The defenders sprang into action. In the narrow alleys of Las Cullas, ambush squads lay in wait, equipped with improvised EMP grenades and repurposed mining lasers. Drones buzzed overhead, their sensors tuned to enemy movements. The resistance fighters knew the city like the back of their hands, and they used every corner, every shadow, to their advantage. The first clash erupted in a sprawling industrial district on the city's edge. Zeeker's enforcers moved in precise formations, their gleaming armor reflecting the crimson sky. But as they advanced, a sudden burst of light erupted from the rooftops, an EMP grenade. The pulse short-circuited several of their suits, leaving them momentarily vulnerable. Resistance fighters swarmed from the shadows, striking hard and fast before retreating into the labyrinthine streets. Badri watched the skirmish unfold through a live drone feed, a satisfied smirk on his face. They're scattered. Keep them guessing. But Zeeker was no fool. From the command deck of his dreadnought, he observed the battle with cold precision. They're trying to divide us, he growled, his voice a low rumble. Reinforce the western quadrant. Flush them out. On the ground, Zeeker's orders were carried out with ruthless efficiency. The enforcers adapted quickly, deploying aerial scouts to counter the resistance's guerrilla tactics. The once chaotic battle began to tilt in their favor as they pushed deeper into the city. Back in the command center, Kala slammed her fist on the console. They're adapting faster than we anticipated. We need to change the game. Badri's eyes narrowed as he studied the holomap. His mind raced, weighing options. Then, inspiration struck. Oren's disruptor. If we can lure a critical mass of their forces into one location, we can use it to cripple them. Kala frowned. And how do we convince them to walk into a trap? Badri grinned. By making it look like we're desperate. Within minutes, the resistance began a calculated retreat, pulling back toward the central market district. Zeeker's troops, emboldened by their apparent advantage, pursued relentlessly. The market district was a sprawling maze of narrow streets and towering structures, a perfect setting for what Badri had in mind. As the enemy closed in, Oren and his team worked frantically to position the disruptor. The device was mounted atop a repurposed cargo drone, its oscillating hum growing louder as it powered up. Oren's hands shook as he calibrated the emitter, beads of sweat forming on his brow. I hope this works, he muttered. Kala's voice crackled through his comms. It has to. No pressure. The trap was set. Resistance fighters funneled the enemy troops into the heart of the market district, where the disruptor awaited. Zeeker himself led the charge, his massive frame towering over his enforcers. His golden eyes gleamed with anticipation. End this farce, he barked, raising his plasma axe. But as they advanced, the disruptor activated. A pulse of energy rippled through the air, invisible but devastating. The enforcers staggered, their movements becoming erratic. Some dropped their weapons, clutching their heads, while others froze in confusion. Zeeker roared in fury, shaking off the disruptor's effects through sheer force of will. What sorcery is this? Badri emerged from the shadows, his weapon drawn. It's called ingenuity, Zeeker. You should try it sometime. The resistance fighters seized the moment, launching a coordinated attack. The tide of battle shifted once more, and for the first time, Zeeker's forces seemed vulnerable. But victory was far from assured. Zeeker, undeterred, rallied his remaining troops. The disruptor's power was finite, and its effects were beginning to wane. Badri knew they had bought time, but the final confrontation was inevitable. As the city trembled under the weight of the conflict, Badri and his team prepared for the showdown that would determine the fate of Las Cullas. The air was electric with tension, thick with the acrid stench of smoke and the faint metallic tang of burning plasma. The once bustling streets of Las Cullas had been reduced to a war zone, their bioluminescent glow extinguished under the relentless advance of Zeeker's forces. Fires raged in the distance, casting flickering shadows against the city's jagged skyline. The Arbiter's spire loomed above it all, a solitary beacon of resistance in a sea of encroaching destruction. Badri stood in the shadow of a crumbling overpass, his breath shallow and his body bristling with energy. His comm buzzed in his ear, Kala's voice cutting through the static. "Badri, they've regrouped. Zeeker's pushing straight for the spire. Whatever you're planning, it needs to happen now." Badri clenched his jaw, his mind racing. The disruptor had bought them precious time, but the enemy had adapted, their strategy evolving with a terrifying efficiency. The enforcers were no longer mindlessly advancing, they were methodically dismantling the resistance's defenses. Worse, Zeeker had remained nearly unscathed, his imposing presence galvanizing his troops. Badri glanced at the ragtag group of fighters huddled around him, engineers armed with repurposed tools, civilians clutching makeshift weapons, and a handful of soldiers whose armor bore the scars of countless skirmishes. They were exhausted, battered, and outnumbered, but their eyes burned with determination. "All right," Badri said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Here's the play. Zeeker thinks he's walking into the kill zone at the spire. We're going to make him regret it." He knelt, sketching a rough map in the dust with the tip of his blade. "Oren's disruptor has one last charge. We lure Zeeker and his elites into the central plaza, then hit them with everything we've got. It's all or nothing." One of the soldiers, a grizzled veteran named Tarek, frowned. "And what if the disruptor fails?" Badri met his gaze, his expression hard. "Then we improvise. Like we always do." The plan was desperate, but so were they. Badri's team moved quickly, slipping through the ruined streets like shadows. They set charges on key access points, herding Zeeker's forces toward the plaza. Drones buzzed overhead, feeding live intel to Kala, who directed the resistance's remaining fighters from the spire. Meanwhile, Zeeker marched at the head of his troops, his plasma axe slung across his back. His golden eyes scanned the wreckage with cold precision. The Zythan commander exuded an aura of unshakable confidence, his towering frame encased in armor that seemed impervious to the chaos around him. "Commander," one of his enforcers said, gesturing toward a smoldering barricade ahead. "The resistance is pulling back. They're regrouping near the spire." Zeeker's lip curled into a sneer. "Cowards. They think they can delay the inevitable." He raised his arm, signaling his troops to advance. The enforcers moved with military precision, their heavy footsteps echoing through the empty streets. As they approached the plaza, a sudden explosion rocked the ground beneath them. Smoke and debris filled the air, disorienting the advancing troops. From the shadows, resistance fighters struck. They emerged from alleyways and collapsed buildings, their weapons blazing. Plasma bolts lit up the night, cutting through the smoke like streaks of fire. Zeeker's enforcers were caught off guard, their formation breaking as they scrambled to return fire. Badri watched from a nearby rooftop, his rifle trained on the plaza. He saw Zeeker wade into the fray, his plasma axe carving through the smoke with brutal efficiency. The Zythan commander was a whirlwind of destruction, his strikes precise and devastating. "This guy's a one-man army," Badri muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. Kala's voice crackled in his ear. "Badri, the disruptor's in position. Oren's ready." "Good," Badri replied. "Tell him to wait for my signal." As the battle raged, Badri's team executed their plan with precision. Charges detonated at key choke points, funneling Zeeker's forces into the plaza. The resistance fighters fought with a ferocity born of desperation, their attacks coordinated and relentless. But the enemy was relentless, their superior firepower and armor slowly tipping the scales. Finally, Zeeker reached the center of the plaza. His enforcers formed a protective circle around him, their weapons trained on the surrounding buildings. The Zythan commander raised his axe, its blade glowing with an ominous light. "Enough!" Zeeker bellowed, his voice amplified by his armor. "Resistance is futile. Surrender now, and your deaths will be swift. Continue this charade, and I will burn your city to the ground." Badri's voice cut through the comms. "Oren, now!" From a concealed position, Oren activated the disruptor. A pulse of energy radiated from the device, rippling through the plaza like an invisible wave. The enforcers staggered, their movements faltering as the disruptor scrambled their neural systems. Zeeker roared in defiance, his body trembling as he fought against the device's effects. "Hit them!" Badri shouted. The resistance fighters unleashed a coordinated assault, targeting the disoriented enforcers. Plasma bolts rained down from rooftops and alleyways, striking with pinpoint accuracy. One by one, the enforcers fell, their once imposing presence reduced to chaos. But Zeeker was far from defeated. With a guttural roar, he surged forward, his axe cleaving through the disruptor. The device shattered in a burst of sparks, its energy dissipating. The Zythan commander turned his gaze toward Badri, his golden eyes burning with fury. "You," Zeeker growled, pointing his axe at Badri. "This ends now." Badri felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You want me? Come and get me." He darted across the rooftop, drawing Zeeker's attention. The Zythan commander leaped with terrifying speed, landing on the rooftop with a thunderous crash. Badri barely had time to dodge as Zeeker's axe carved through the air, its blade leaving a trail of molten plasma. The two clashed in a brutal melee, their movements a blur of speed and precision. Badri's agility and quick thinking kept him one step ahead, but Zeeker's strength and skill were overwhelming. Each strike of the axe came closer to ending the fight, forcing Badri to rely on every ounce of his training and ingenuity. Below, the resistance fighters fought to mop up the remaining enforcers. Kala led the charge, her sharpshooting taking down enemy stragglers with deadly accuracy. The tide of battle was turning, but the outcome remained uncertain. On the rooftop, Zeeker cornered Badri, his axe poised for a killing blow. "You fought well," Zeeker said, his voice tinged with grudging respect. "But this is the end." Badri smirked, blood trickling from a cut on his cheek. "Not quite." He activated a concealed device on his wrist, triggering a nearby charge. The explosion sent a plume of debris into the air, creating a momentary distraction. Badri seized the opportunity, landing a precise strike against Zeeker's armor. The Zythan staggered, but he quickly regained his footing, his rage only intensifying. As the city burned around them, the two warriors prepared for the final clash, their fates intertwined in a battle that would determine the future of Las Cullas. The night air was thick with smoke and ash, the city of Las Cullas trembling under the weight of destruction. The Arbiter's spire stood tall, its luminescent panels flickering as if the structure itself were gasping for breath. Badri crouched on the rooftop, his breaths coming in shallow bursts, his body aching from the relentless fight. Across from him, Zeeker loomed like a shadow of inevitability, his plasma axe glowing ominously, the blade humming with a deadly resonance. Below them, the plaza was a battlefield of chaos and desperation. Resistance fighters clashed with the remaining enforcers, their numbers dwindling with each passing moment. Despite their grit and ingenuity, the resistance was on the verge of collapse. Oren's disruptor was gone, shattered by Zeeker's wrath, and the enemy forces were beginning to regroup. The battle's end seemed near, and not in their favor. Badri wiped the blood from his cheek and forced himself to stand, his legs trembling beneath him. His mind raced for a plan, something, anything, that could turn the tide. But Zeeker didn't give him time to think. With a guttural roar, the Zythan commander lunged, his axe carving a blazing arc through the air. Badri ducked and rolled to the side, the axe missing him by inches and leaving a molten scar on the rooftop. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," Badri said, his voice laced with mock bravado. Zeker snarled, his golden eyes blazing with fury. "Enough games, human. You've defied me long enough. Your city burns, your people are finished. Accept your fate." Badri smirked, though the weight of Zeker's words pressed heavily on him. "Funny thing about fate, it's a lot like your plans. Easily broken." Zeker lunged again, faster this time. Badri barely dodged, his shoulder grazing the edge of the axe's energy field. The pain was searing, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving, weaving through the debris-strewn rooftop. He needed time to think, time to act, time for the others to hold the line below. In the plaza below, Kala and the remaining resistance fighters fought tooth and nail. The resistance had managed to isolate the last of Zeker's enforcers, but the fight was brutal. Kala's rifle crackled with energy as she took down another armored foe, her precision unmatched even in the chaos. "Hold the line," she shouted, her voice cutting through the cacophony. "We just need a few more minutes." Tarek, the grizzled veteran, fired his plasma cannon, the recoil nearly knocking him off his feet. "Minutes we don't have, Kala," he yelled. "We're out of ammo, out of people, and out of luck." Kala gritted her teeth, her mind racing. She knew Tarek was right. The resistance was running on fumes, and the enforcers were relentless. She activated her comms, hoping against hope. "Oren, tell me you've got something." Oren's voice crackled through the static, strained but determined. "I'm working on it. Give me 60 seconds. "Make it 30, Kala snapped, ducking behind cover as a plasma bolt sizzled past her head. Oren was holed up in a makeshift lab several blocks away, frantically assembling what little he had left. The disruptor was destroyed, but the components were still viable. He was cobbling together a smaller, more focused device, a single-use pulse emitter designed to take out Zeker himself. "It's not going to be pretty," Oren muttered, his hands trembling as he soldered the final connections. "But it'll have to do." Back on the rooftop, the fight between Badri and Zeker raged on. Badri's movements were growing slower, his body battered and bruised. Zeker, on the other hand, seemed almost unstoppable, his strikes growing more forceful with each swing. "You're resilient," Zeker admitted, his tone begrudgingly respectful. "But resilience won't save you." Badri stumbled, barely managing to block Zeker's next strike with his blade. The impact sent shockwaves through his arm, nearly making him drop the weapon. He was running out of options. But then his comm crackled to life. "Badri," Oren's voice came through, breathless but triumphant. "I've got something. It's crude, but it'll work. I just need you to get Zeker into position." Badri glanced at the plaza below. His team was barely holding on, their defensive line crumbling. He had no choice. "What's the range?" 50 meters. "But it has to be direct." Badri nodded grimly. "Got it." He turned to face Zeker, his grip tightening on his blade. "You talk a big game," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "But I've seen bigger." Zeker growled, his golden eyes narrowing. "You dare mock me?" "Just stating the facts," Badri replied. "Come on, big guy. Let's finish this." With a roar, Zeker charged, his plasma axe raised high. Badri sprinted toward the edge of the rooftop, the wind whipping past him. He could feel the heat of the axe behind him, each swing coming closer and closer. At the last moment, Badri leapt off the rooftop, landing hard on a lower platform. Zeker followed without hesitation, his massive frame shaking the structure as he landed. Badri darted through the narrow pathways, leading Zeker closer to the plaza. "Oren, I'm in position." Badri shouted into his comm. "I see you," Oren replied. "Hold him there." Easier said than done, Badri thought. Zeker was relentless, his strikes growing more ferocious as he closed the distance. Badri ducked and dodged, his every movement a desperate attempt to stay alive. Finally, Orrin's voice came through again. It's ready. Get clear, now. Badri didn't hesitate. He bolted for the edge of the platform, leaping down into the plaza. Zeker followed, his rage blinding him to the trap. Orrin activated the pulse emitter. A concentrated wave of energy erupted from the device, focused directly on Zeker. The Zythan commander staggered, his movements jerky and uncoordinated as the pulse disrupted his neural systems. Badri seized the opportunity. He charged at Zeker, his blade glowing with energy. With a swift, precise strike, he severed the power core of Zeker's armor. Sparks flew as the armor powered down, leaving Zeker vulnerable. The Zythan fell to his knees, his golden eyes dimming. This is not over, he growled, his voice weak. Badri stood over him, his chest heaving. Oh, it's over, he said, his tone resolute. Las Cullas doesn't belong to you. With that, the resistance fighters surged forward, their cheers echoing through the ruined city. The battle was won, but the cost was high. The streets of Las Cullas were littered with the debris of war, and the survivors bore the weight of what they had endured. As dawn broke over the city, Badri stood atop the Arbiter's spire, looking out over the horizon. Kala joined him, her face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. We did it, she said, her voice soft. Badri nodded, a faint smile on his lips. Yeah. We did. In the distance, the Galactic Council's dreadnought retreated, its engines a dim glow against the rising sun. The people of Las Cullas had won their freedom, for now. But they knew the fight was far from over.